Okay, ready?
All right. Moshe
Okay.
will give a share now on Parshas Bo.
That's right. Okay, Parshas Bo. This is after it discusses Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Jewish people actually leaving Egypt, and it concludes with the mitzvah of tefillin. And the first two parshios, the first two paragraphs that are found in the tefillin are mentioned in Parshas Bo. There are four paragraphs of the Torah that are put into the tefillin. According to Rashi's opinion, they are in the order that they are in the Torah. In other words, first you have the Parsha of Kadesh, the Parsha of Kadesh, which is in Parshas Bo. This week's Sedra talks about the Jewish people remembering through various mitzvos to remember the Yetzias Mitzrayim, to remember the Exodus from Egypt. And then you have the Parsha of Vahaya Kibiyacha, which also speaks of mitzvos whose purpose is to remember the Exodus and emphasizes some of the mitzvos of Pesach, like matzah, and the mitzvah of Haggadah. And then we have the Parsha. It's obviously not in this week's Sedra. On the contrary, it's in Chumash Dvarim. In Parshas Veschanan, you have the Parsha of Shema, and you have the Parsha of Bahayim Shemoah. Now, so the first two parshios focuses on mitzvahs. The first two parshios in the Tefillin, the first two paragraphs from the Torah that are in the Tefillin, focuses on the mitzvos that are associated with the Exodus from Egypt. And the last two paragraphs that are in the Tefillin focuses on Shema V'Hayim Shemoah, which has as its main focus Kabbalah Ol Malchus Shemayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. In a sense, we could suggest that the first two parshios focuses on the historical relationship that exists between God and the Jewish people, how God was there for the Jewish people, and hopefully that will inspire us not just to know about the past, but to realize that God will always be there for the Jewish people. And the last two parshios in the Tefillin, Shema and V'Hayim Shemoah, they focus on the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And Rashi's opinion is that the order that these parshios, these paragraphs of the Torah on the Tefillin, is in the order that they are in the Torah. Kadesh is mentioned first. It's mentioned in this week's Sedra. Vahaya Kibiyacha is mentioned the next week, is mentioned this week's Sedra also. Shema is mentioned in Chumash Dvarim, and Vahayim Shemoah also in Chumash Dvarim. And Shema is mentioned before Vahayim Shemoah. Consequently, the parshios in the Tefillin are in the order that they are in the Torah. But it's important to point out that according to Rashi's opinion, the four parshios are in the order of the Torah, but it doesn't start from the right of the wearer of the tefillin, but the Kadesh, which is the first parsha, is from the right of the observer of the tefillin, the one who stands opposite the one who wears the tefillin. So that's Rashi's opinion. Now, everybody knows that there is a famous argument between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Since I'm a little boy, I heard about the dispute between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam in terms of the order of the Parshios in the Tefillin. Rabbeinu Tam's opinion, Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin is that yes, we have Kadesh first, we have V'haya K'viyacha second, but interestingly, he puts V'hayim Shemoa third and Shema last. So Rabbeinu Tam, okay, he bases it on a Gemara, but we have to, the way he reads the Gemara in Menachos, but we have to understand what's the logic. What is the logic to assume that the order of the Parshios in the Tefillin, the order of the paragraphs of the Torah that are put in the Tefillin are not in the same order that they are in the Torah itself? Because in the Torah itself, Shema becomes before V'hayim Shemoa. And that's how when we say Shema, that's how we say Shema. We say Shema first, and then we say V'hayim Shemoa. But Rabbeinu Tam says in the Tefillin, you put V'hayim Shemoa first, and then Shema. So we have to understand why is there this difference? Why this difference? And why is it not in the order of the Torah? Now, the question is, why are there 4 parshios in the Tefillin, 4 paragraphs in the Tefillin? Why, if you look in the Tefillin Shel Rosh, the Tefillin on the head, there are 4 separate compartments, 4 batim. So how do we know that there are 4 batim and 4 parshios in Tefillin? In the Tefillin Shel Rosh, there are 4 parshios in the Tefillin Shel Yad, but it's written on one piece of parchment, and there's only one bias, one compartment. But in the Tefillin Shel Rosh, in the Tefillin of the head, the Tefillin has 4 separate compartments, and each compartment has a separate parsha in it. So where do they get the number 4? So Rabbi Akiva, and this is the shita that Rashi constantly brings down in his commentary in Chumash, he said the word totafos. We say in V'haya la'os al yadcha, the last pasuk in this week's Sedra, uletotafos beinei necha, and for a totafos, according to Rashi Shita, totafos means like an ornament. But he says the word totafos, there are other words in Hebrew that could be used for ornament. But why was the word totafos used? So according to Rabbi Akiva, tot in the Caspian language, Caspi, Lashon Caspi. Apparently, this probably was a country. This is a guess on my part. I have no evidence for this, but it's probably a country near the Caspian Sea. So among the Caspian people, certainly in the time of Matan Torah, the word tot meant 2, and fos in the African language at the time of Matan Torah meant it means 2. Well, we all know 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So the Torah, in using the word totafos, for an ornament, that the tefillin on the head should be like an ornament, using the word totafos uses the unusual word of totafos, which has the word tot, which means 2 in the Caspian language, and fos, which is 2 in the African language. And that's how we know that there are 4 parshios. Now, all the commentaries are somewhat perplexed that we use words that are not part of Lashon Kodesh, not part of Hebrew. for a drasha. In other words, except where it's specified, Yigar Sadusa, whatever, with the assumption is, at least certainly in the Chumash, the words used are Hebrew words. All of a sudden, we make a drasha. We make a drasha on the basis of the Caspian language and the African language. How are we to understand such a thing? So some of the commentaries say that originally, Tot and Fos were part of the Jewish language, of Lashon Kodesh, of the Hebrew language. But then, when God spread mankind all over the world in the time of the Migdal Bavel, and he gave each set of people a different language. Some words from Hebrew crept into the foreign languages. And Tot and Fos were at least originally part of the Hebrew language. But when people were sent all over the earth, so the people who went to the Caspian language, people who they took the word Tot, and the people going to Africa took the word Fos, but it really has its origin in the Jewish language, and by implication, it's not that it's no longer part of the Jewish language. It remained part of the Jewish language, just that it was used perhaps more frequently by other languages. I want to suggest two other answers. One answer is, the Torah tells us, the Gemara mentions in Brachas, the Gemara mentions in Menachos, there's a pasuk, V'rou kol amei aretz, ki shem Hashem nikra elecha. All the nations of the world will see that the name of God is called upon you. Amar Rabbi Lezer Gadol, the Gemara says, Rabbi Lezer Gadol said, Elu tefillin sheparosh. How will they see the name of God being identified with you, Nikra Alecha, through the tefillin of the Rosh? Now, symbolically, there's a shin, there's a dalet in the ritzuos, there's a yud in the ritzuos, whatever. So the name of God is identified with the tefillin sharos. Rashi says most of the name of God, because the shin and the dalet, the shin is inscribed on the tefillin, the dalet is in the back of the neck. The yud is by the tefillin shalyad, the tefillin of the hand, but most of the name of God is in the tefillin shalrosh. So all the nations of the world will see that the name of God is associated with you, and symbolic of that is the tefillin of the rosh, the tefillin of the head. Now, so we could say, since part of the purpose of tefillin is the identification of the Jewish people with the name of God, with the name of God by the nations of the world. So because of that, specifically here, words of foreign languages, and perhaps these words had an origin in the Hebrew language, as the commentaries say. But why is it used specifically here when it's not used anywhere else? It's used specifically here because part of the purpose of Tefillin Shel Rosh, which is identified with the word Totafos, is for the nations of the world to see the identification of God with the Jewish people. And of course, foreign languages, that has to do with the nations of the world. So to emphasize that point, there was a Gzeres HaKosav, a certain halacha was revealed using the languages of the nations of the world, whose origin might have been in Hebrew. However, I think there was another shot. But I'll go into that if we have time later on. And that is that the tefillin have a special relationship for the Jewish people of Chutz La'aretz. And one of the, in a sense, and I'll explain how, the tefillin serve as the symbol of the observance of mitzvah. Tefillin and mezuzah serve as the symbol of the observance of mitzvos outside the land of Israel. As Rashi points out in Parshas Eikev. So the tefillin, so it is identified with a society, with the Jewish people being in a society that is not theirs, in a society that speaks a different language, a society that has a different culture. Consequently, there is a special Gzeres HaKosav. There's a special pasuk that makes use of foreign languages to emphasize this point. Now, I want to suggest that to answer our original question, the original question was, how is it that Rabbeinu Tam places the Parshios of the Tefillin, the Parshios that the paragraphs of the Torah in the Tefillin, not in the order that they are in the Torah. Now, my uncle suggested a pshat. It's really a beautiful pshat, besides being a brilliant explanation. My uncle suggested that the Gzeres HaKosav, according to Rabbi Akiva, of Totofos, Tot being two and Phos being two, is not to be understood as four, but it should be understood as two sets of two. And what my uncle suggested is that that this is the way Rabbeinu Tam understood it, that we have two sets of two parshios, and each set starts from the outside. So from the perspective of the person who is opposite the wearer of the tefillin, from the perspective of the person who is opposite the wearer of the tefillin, so the tefillin from right to left of the observer talks about the Exodus. So it mentions Kadesh v'Hayev Kiviyacha. But then, from the left of the observer, which is the right of the wearer, starting from the outside, it has Shema and V'Hayim Shemoah, which is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Now, the question is, why should it be that way? Why should it be that way? Now, I think, based on what we said previously, we could understand it, because previously we mentioned that there's a special emphasis by the mitzvah of tefillin in terms of the nations, of the observation of the Jewish people wearing tefillin by the nations of the world. Now, when non-Jewish people look at the Jewish people, where do they see their identification with God? They see their identification with God by God in Jewish history, and the Jewish people surviving throughout all the years of their history, by the Jewish people being able to overcome the hindrance of exile. So because of that, the Jewish people, because now, a matter of fact, I remember during the 6-Day War, and at that time, Russia was considered the supporter of the Arab countries, of Nasser, of Egypt, of Jordan, of Syria, who declared war against Israel. And at that time, before the war, there was a different impression today. But that time before the war, many Jews were scared that and I know we're scared. We heard about all the schoolyards that were being dug up to be graveyards because they were expecting a great tragedy. Yes, Israel probably thought that they would be victorious, which they were, but they thought it would be at a much greater price. Listen, even 500 some odd Jews were killed in the war. That in itself is a great price, but they were expecting many more casualties. So at that time, and then Israel, in lightning speed, was victorious in the 6-Day War. And at that time, I remember in the Tribune, they had a cartoon. And in the cartoon, they had an Arab with his special hat and a bear behind him, symbolizing the Russia. And opposite him was a little boy. Today, they would never paint Israel as a little boy, with one of those type of hats, white hats, that the kibbutzniks used to wear. And there was a lightning in the sky, and in the lightning was written, God of Israel. And that young kibbutznik, I hope the kibbutzniks today would have the same attitude as the kibbutznik in the cartoon. He points with his finger to that lightning in the sky. And he says, I too have a big brother. In other words, what impressed the nations of the world? Israel was expected to have many more casualties. But many among the nations of the world, at least momentarily, recognized the divine help that Israel had in the war. Because it's not so much our religious observance that impresses the nations of the world, but what impresses the nations of the world is the aid of God in the survival of Israel, in the survival of the Jewish people. So we could suggest that we have two groups of two. One group of two on the right side of the observer, the one who watches the person, who watches the Jew wearing the tefillin. What does that talk about? It talks about the Exodus, about how God helped the Jewish people, how we recognize that God helped the Jewish people, and we want to remember how God helped the Jewish people. And this actually is not just limited to the Exodus, but this is the blueprint for all future problems that the Jewish people will have with the nations of the world. We have to look forward to the help of God, because it's only through the help of God we will survive. So on the right side of the observer, you see Kadesh and Vahaya Kabiyacha. But this is what I'm adding to my uncle's explanation of Rabbeinu Tam. But on the right side of the observer, on the right side of the wearer of the tefillin, you have Shman V'Hayim Shemoa, because for the Jewish people, our main focus is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. We accept the yoke of heaven. So from the right side of the observer, who represents the nations of the world, they're impressed with Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the precedent of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. But the Jewish person himself, the wearer of the tefillin, what is most important, or what should be most important to them, is Shman V'Hayim Shemoa, the acceptance of the yoke of God, acceptance the yoke of the Torah, of mitzvos. So that's one way we could explain Rabbeinu Tam Shita. Now, this works very well if we accept Rabbi Akiva Shita, that the reason there are four parshios in the tefillin and four batim in the tefillin shalosh in the tefillin of the head, four compartments, is because the word tot means two, and the word fos means two, and 2 + 2 is 4. So 2 sets of 2. However, it's interesting that Rabbi Yishmael has an altogether different explanation. Rabbi Yishmael in the Gemara says that how do we know there are 2 sets of 2? Now, I'm explaining it now according to Tosfos, Rabbi Yishmael Shita, not according to Rashi. Rashi requires special explanation. Tosfos explains the word totafos in regard to tefillin is mentioned 3 times. It's mentioned in the Parsha B'Hayik Diyacha in this week's Sedra. It's mentioned in Shema, and it's mentioned in V'Hayim Shemoa. But the way Tosfos through a drasha explains, the totafos mentioned, of course you're not going to see it that way, the way it's written in the Torah, but through a drasha, Tosfos says the totafos in V'Hayik Diyacha, from a drasha perspective, the vav at the ula totafos, the vav at the beginning of the word, is pushed to after the pay. So it's read, if you don't have a vav, so the word could be read totefes, totefes. But if there is a vav there, it's totafos. So he says that in V'Hayik Diyacha, the word is totafos in the plural form. Whereas in Shema and V'Hayim Shemoa, he says there is no vav between the pei and the saf. Consequently, it can only be read as totefa. It could be read as totefes. So each one is singular. So that's why we have 4 parshios. That's according to Rabbi Yishmael. So the question is, according to Rabbi Yishmael, how do we explain Rabbeinu Tam Shita? Now, in order to answer that question, we have to raise another question, a question that was raised by the Rishonim, which is really very difficult. And it's a question against our Sedra. In our Sedra, we're told about the mitzvah of tefillin. The mitzvah of tefillin was given to the Jewish people in Egypt, or as they were leaving Egypt. So the question is, there are 4 parshios in the mitzvah of tefillin. Kadesh and V'Hayik Diyacha, which was given to them as they were leaving Egypt. We understand how that could be included in the mitzvah of tefillin that they received in the Egypt itself. But it also, Parsha Tefillin also has the Parshas, the paragraphs of Shema V'Hayim Shemoa. And Shema V'Hayim Shemoa is only mentioned in Chumash Dvarim. So how perhaps a person could suggest that at the time of Matan Torah it was given to them, but clearly in Egypt itself, they did not yet have seemingly the Parsha of Shema v'Hayim Shemoah. So how could they have been required when they left Egypt in the mitzvah of tefillin, when they did not yet have the last two parshios that were necessary for the mitzvah of tefillin? So in the Rishonim we find two explanations. One explanation, they're both in the parish that is assumed to be, that some assume to be the parish of the Rashba Menachos. It's probably the Tosfos Rid, but in any case, that's kind of irrelevant. There are two answers given. One is that we could suggest that because of the mitzvah tefillin, all four parshios were given to the Jewish people at the time when they left Egypt, because of the mitzvah tefillin. Just when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote over the whole Torah before he died, so then he included Shema and V'Hayim Shemoah at the end of the Torah in the Chumash Devarim. But Shema and V'Hayim Shemoah as parshios were given to the Jewish people at the time they got the mitzvah tefillin. That's one answer that's given. The other answer given was Enochinami. Originally, the mitzvah tefillin only had two parshios. Originally, it only had two paragraphs of Kadesh and V'Haya Kibiyacha. But later on, at whatever period of time, Shema and V'Hayim Shemoah was given to them, and at that time, the mitzvah of tefillin was increased from two parshios to four parshios. They had to add two more parshios and perhaps two more batim to their tefillin. Now, but we have to ask a question. A person could suggest that, now we saw Rabbi Akiva said that how do we know there are four parshios in tefillin? So Rabbi Akiva said that there are four parshios in the tefillin because the word totafos it means 2 plus 2. It follows that Rabbi Akiva, who says that we with just one word totafos, we understand that it requires four parshios. Rabbi Akiva is forced to say that the Jewish people at the time they left Egypt were given all four parshios. Because after all, the word totafos is mentioned in V'Haya Kibiyacha, in the second parsha of this week's Sedra, before Shema V'Hayim Shemoah is mentioned in the Torah. So, but they're told in this week's Sedra they need tefillin with four parshios. How could they have tefillin with four parshios? And totafos is mentioned in this week's Sedra. So obviously, according to Rabbi Akiva, we have to say that all four parshios were given to the Jewish people at the time they received the tefillin. I could explain it differently, but this more simple approach is this way. However, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the way Tosfos understands Rabbi Yishmael, he says that through a drasha, reading of a drasha, when we read Totafos in this week's Sedra, we read it with a vav between the pei and the saf. So they're told in this week's Sedra only about two parshios, and then in the Chumash Devarim, they're given two other parshios, both which say totefes. So we could suggest that according to Rabbi Yishmael, they were originally only given 2 parshios. We can then say that because of the historical order in which the parshios were given, they were given also in sets of 2. In Egypt, according to Rabbi Yishmael, they were given only 2 parshios. The parshios that dealt with the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. But then, later on, perhaps shortly before Moshe Rabbeinu died, perhaps at the time of Matan Torah, whatever it might be, they were given 2 other parshios that dealt with Kabbalah Malchus Shemayim, Shema and V'hayim Shemoah. So since historically it was given at 2 sets of 2, since historically each set began from the other side. And the reason it was in that order, as I mentioned before, because the right side of the observer is what impresses the nations of the world. They see God in Jewish history. Whereas what has to be most important to us is God from the perspective of Kabbalah Malchus Shemayim, of accepting the yoke of heaven. So from the right of the wearer, you have Shema and V'hayim Shemoah. So that's how we could explain the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, the Rashi at the end of Parshas Eikim, so he says the Torah there, that's the Parsha V'hayim Shemoah, after telling the Jewish people about their going into exile. So it emphasizes the Torah tells us about the mitzvah of mezuzah and tefillin, and he says that the mitzvah of mezuzah and tefillin has to be observed in Chutz La'aretz, in exile, even in order that the Jews should not forget it when they return to Eretz Yisrael. Now, how are we to understand it? And I think the simple explanation is that, so tefillin, and Rashi says, tefillin and mezuzah is a symbol for all the other mitzvahs of the Torah. Just like tefillin and mezuzah has to be observed in exile, so too do the other mitzvahs of the Torah have to be observed in exile. So the question is, why was tefillin and mezuzah used as an example? Now, mezuzah represents it has to do with dwelling. Let's say in the Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel, it's only if you live in a house for 30 days does it require a mezuzah. But if you don't, you're not going to live there 30 days. It doesn't require a mezuzah. In Eretz Yisrael, even one day, why? I assume Eretz Yisrael, that's the dwelling place of a Jew. So to a certain degree, a person could have suggested that the Chutz La'aretz, the Torah did not want outside the land of Israel to be identified as a dwelling place of the Jew. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, we're just sojourners. We're traveling through. We're looking forward to return. So the Torah has to tell us, no, even in the Chutz La'aretz, you need to observe mezuzah and the other mitzvahs as well. Because if you don't observe the mezuzah outside Eretz Yisrael, when you return, you won't return. You observe it either. I think it's because of the power of assimilation. Do not feel confident that you'll observe it. And also, part of the idea is that wherever you dwell, You have to realize you're dwelling with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God. And the mitzvah of tefillin, what is the idea? What is the idea behind the mitzvah of tefillin? Now, I want to suggest that perhaps we could explain Rabbeinu Tam's opinion a different way. Rabbeinu Tam says that it's not in the order of the Torah. The question we raised is, if it's not, why isn't the tefillin in the order of the Torah? Now, I already mentioned that some Rishonim say that all 4 Parshas were given to the Jewish people when they left Egypt. They left Egypt. So if we say all 4 Parshas were given, we could suggest that in the Torah, Shema comes before V'hayim Shemoah. But when the Jewish people received the 4 Parshas in Egypt, V'hayim Shemoah came before Shema. Why did V'hayim Shemoah come before Shema? The answer is, the Jewish people have a double relationship with God. On one hand, we are the children of God. Not only the children of God, but the eldest of the children. B'ni B'chorei Yisrael. On the other hand, we are the servants of God. We're the avodim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And you have avodim on different levels. You have an eved. The lowest level of an eved is one who works for his master only because al minas l'kabel pras, because his life is dependent upon the master, because he receives food from the master. And on a higher level, you have the yiras haromimus, the fear of God, the awe of God. That's the higher level of Eved, of servant of God. Now, the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, their perspective of themselves was as slaves. In other words, they were going from the service of Paro into the service of God. To a certain degree, we could suggest that why the Jewish people constantly rebel against God and against Moshe. Because in a sense, God and Moshe, depending on the time, in their minds replaced Paro. And all the feelings that they had against Paro and against Paro, they took out against HaKadosh Baruch Hu and against Moshe. So so because of this, there was as slaves, the Jewish people, their initial focus when they left Egypt, their self-perspective were ones of slaves, of servants. So their initial relationship with God was one of the servants of God more than the children of God. Now, when you take a look at the difference between Parshas Shema and Parshas V'hayim Shemoah, what does Shema say? Shema talks about love of God. It doesn't talk about reward and punishment. I think Shema represents the father's-child relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the B'ni B'chorei Yisrael. How are we attached to God? We are attached to God with ropes, not physical ropes, but we're attached to God with emotional ropes, like a child has towards his parent and a parent has towards the child. However, when you take a look at the Parsha of V'hayim Shemoah, there, Torah warns you. He said, if you'll observe the mitzvahs, you'll get the crop, you'll get rain, everything will be good. But But be careful, lest you be worshiping idolatry. And then your crops, you won't have crops, you won't have anything. And you'll be sent into Golus, you'll be sent into exile. So when the Jewish people came out, so in other words, the Parsha of V'hayim Shemoah emphasizes the servant-master relationship we have with God. When the Jewish people came out of Egypt, they didn't focus so much on the child-parent relationship with God. They focused on the servant-master relationship that they had with God. And because of that, when the mitzvah tefillin was given in Egypt, and 4 parshios were given with it, so V'hayim Shemoah was given before Shema, because at that point the Jewish people primarily saw themselves as servants of God, not so much as children of God. So therefore, according to Rabbeinu Tam, we could say the V'hayim Shemoah comes before the Shema in the tefillin. Now, what is the idea of the tefillin? The tefillin, we tie ourselves to the bottom. We use the ritzuos, the straps of the tefillin is tied to our head, ties the tefillin to our head and ties it to our hand. A servant, a slave, is tied to his master. If it's emotional ropes, you don't have to worry. A child doesn't leave his parent, the parent doesn't leave the child. But where it's servitude, the slowest form of servitude, the slave is tied to his master. So the tefillin, yes, it's an ornament, and our ornament is that we are in the service of God, but it represents being tied. It's a symbol of being servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of being servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in the tefillin, the V'hayim Shemoah, especially when they came out of Egypt, V'hayim Shemoah came before the Shema. However, later on, as a result of Matan Torah and as a result of the Jewish people going through the desert, so the main focus, the focus of being the father-child relationship, that gained more importance. So a person might suggest that so long as we're in Israel, we're in the home next to where the Beis Hamikdash was. So we have that child-parent relationship with God. And also, we are the servants of God in the land of Israel. But when we go into exile, when we go into Roman exile, we go into Babylonian exile, and we go to exile in all the other countries, all of a sudden there are replacements for God. The leaders of those countries, usually who are anti-Semites, who hate the Jewish religion, and to a large degree hate the Jewish people, they become the masters. And when they become the masters, to a certain degree, our being servants of God becomes limited. God said, they are my servants and not the servants of slaves of other people. So a person might suggest that when we go into exile and we're under the oppression of other leaders, they become our masters. God is no longer our master. There's no place for the mitzvah of tefillin. There's no place for the mitzvah of tefillin in Golus and exile. So it's important for us to know that in exile, God is our master as well. And the mitzvah of tefillin emphasizes that point, that in exile, God is our master as well. Because if we fail to see God as our master in exile, when we return to Israel, as a result of the assimilation, we will try to rid ourselves. We will continue to not recognizing God as our master. You see, there are many who return to the land of Israel that recognize the concept of a Jewish people and who accomplished a lot on behalf of the Jewish people. But unfortunately, they do not recognize God as their master. We have to, in Golos, in exile, we have to recognize God as our master also. That will ensure that we will continue to recognize God as our master when we re-enter the land of Israel. So this is the mitzvah of tefillin. The mitzvah of tefillin emphasizes the idea of God as our master, both in Eretz Yisrael and outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. Now, but in the mitzvah of Shema, that's based on the relationship that was developed later, where the main focus is the acceptance of God not just as master, but mainly the acceptance of God with the father-child relationship, a parent-child relationship, the parent-child relationship. So when we say Shema, and in the Torah, Shema becomes before V'hayim Shema. Okay.
Questions in the chat, please.
There is one question in the chat.
Yeah.
Is there any reason that Mekubalim put two sets of the tefillin on at the same time?
Is there any reason to have two sets of tefillin at the same time? Okay, from a halachic perspective, I don't. Those who say don't, because suffik the araisa l'chumra, because if there is a doubt which is the correct pair, even though at this point Rashi is the main shita that was accepted, there were times when Rabbeinu Tam shita was the main shita that's accepted. What changed the practice to a large degree probably was the Zohar. The Zohar said the main tefillin is Rashi's tefillin. However, Mekubalim, and perhaps based on the Zohar, certainly in some of the Sfar of Reb Chaim Vital, they say that there is a spread that in the upper worlds, Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin is more important. But halachically, Rashi's tefillin is the main tefillin. Halachically, Rashi's tefillin is the main tefillin. Now, Reb Chaim Volozhiner used to put on both Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. And when he mentioned it to the Vilna Gaon felt Rashi's tefillin was correct. So the Vilna Gaon said to Reb Chaim Volozhiner that if you want to be machmir for Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin, you want to be machmir for all the machloksim, all the different opinions, you'll need 64 pairs of tefillin. The truth is, you probably today need more because there are many, many different opinions on many different issues. So because of that, Reb Chaim Volozhiner only started wearing only Rashi's tefillin and stopped wearing Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. However, the Shulchan Aruch mentions that it's a good thing to wear Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin also. I assume, as far as the question about all the other issues that are involved, why we're not machmir for all the shitos on the other issues, I would suggest the reason is because up till like the 1300s, most people wore Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. So even though the practice changed to Rashi's tefillin, since for a long period of time Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin was the main form of tefillin, So people decided that they should start. That was originally what was accepted. Consequently, they were machmir for Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin also. But that's my own theory. Anything else?
So it says if the Torah wasn't written yet, how do they know which Parshas to include? And then somebody
So I mentioned, they say, well, the two Parshas were certainly given in Egypt. And then, according to some, all 4 Parshios were given in Egypt.
Then what about people wearing tefillin all day?
The Rambam says that that a person, the contrary, that it's a very good thing to do. He even implies that it's a requirement. But the assumption is a person has to have his mind and thoughts in a proper manner for wearing tefillin all day. So let's people who wore on a special level would wear tefillin all day. But those that today, we do not consider ourselves to be on that special level. Because tefillin, you have to be very careful of what you're thinking about when you wear it, whatever it is. So we wear it just for the basic requirement. Yeah, okay.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay, so that's it.
Daniel, you see any other questions? No. Okay, thank you, Moshe, and thank you
Thank
to
you.
everybody for listening.